This. Let's get started. For sure today we are so excited to be able to talk about this topic. This session's really going to examine one of the fastest growing areas in special education risk, and it's those gaps between what services an IEP requires and what a student actually receives. So I'm super excited about today's session. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Sarah Binns. I'm a principal researcher and a content specialist on the Progress Center. And then Alina, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Alina. I am a senior TA consultant with the American Institutes for Research, and I'm also an attorney. I'm not representing legal advice today, which Sarah's going to get to in a moment here with our disclaimer, and work on a number of centers and have really enjoyed the opportunity to present and do this webinar series here with the Progress Center.
And yes, we have to say this disclaimer. We are not providing legal advice. We can't respond as attorneys. All of those things, all these services are just provided as general information and purposes only. Make sure you read the disclaimer, but that's the big picture. So let's see what we're doing today in the next slide. So for our agenda, we're really going to get into those IEP implementation requirements. I'm really excited about this section on hotspots. So they'll feel kind of familiar. I hope they don't, but they might feel a little familiar when we recognize those implementation risks. Then we're going to talk about what you're here for, that leadership lens. We're going to look at some failure to implement case examples and to do a system check. What do leaders do? How can you get ahead of this? And then we'll do takeaways and next steps. It sounds fun. I'm excited. So let's get into it. And for our first activity, since this really is about missed minutes and how to avoid and address them, let's take a moment really quick to reflect on some sights and sounds of failure to implement in action. So here's some sights and sounds. School lunch and office staff haven't been trained in a child's behavior intervention plan and don't offer choices during a situation in the lunchroom as outlined in the plan. Sure, that's not you. A child, this one. Boy, as a former special ed director, this one. A child transfers into your district from the neighboring school system with an IEP. It's 3 weeks before you've been able to get a copy of that IEP and begin to implement comparable services. Next one, a quote that I'm sure none of your educators have ever said, but in my class, all my students take the final exam as I design it. Yeep. The next one, a child's IEP needs repaired and it takes 6 weeks to get it fixed and back to the school. Or they've lost the charger, right? None of that's ever happened to you. The iPad serves as the child's augmented communication device. The new special education teacher you hired backed out of their contract last minute, and you worked to fill the position but aren't able to hire someone until October. Yeah, that's real. Next one. Oh, that's our last one. So, really quick in the chat, what's resonating with you? Have you had any of these experiences happen? What level of risk are you seeing in these situations? You can just throw your answers in the chat real quick. Yeah, Catherine, I hope I'm saying that right, but special education staff not hired by the time school begins. Yeah, that's real, right? That happens. Lynn, with staff turning over, number one is really challenging. How do we make sure that everyone in the system knows about a student's accommodations? The transfer student hit home. Yeah, absolutely. Alicia, the need to ensure lunch staff have the understanding of a child's behavior plan, because unstructured times are super difficult as it already is, right? That's one that often gets forgotten. Any others? I'm glad to see that not anyone said anything about the in my class, all my students take the final exam as I design it. That's good, right? We're making headway. So, as you can see, many of these situations are not new to you. You've experienced similar situations and more. State complaints, due process complaints, informal disputes often center on these sort of implementation failure cases, right? And it's this rising source of state complaints and due process cases over the past couple of years. So, our goal really today is to ground you in those legal requirements that will make sure that you're able to spot the failure to implement issues and make decisions about how to mitigate those issues as quickly as possible. We put a lot on our leaders, right? You have to understand not only the law, but also the knowledge of practical systems to be able to identify these failures and to quickly address them to proactively prevent that formal complaint process. So, before we even get to failure to implement, we really need to be grounded in those requirements around implementing the IEP. So I am going to turn that over to Alina to kind of go through how we stay grounded and what the IEP implementation requirements are.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everyone for that, for the chat engagement and the reinforcement. I was realizing as you were reading through the sights and sounds, Sarah, that may or may not have been calling upon my, 5 years as a local special ed director or overseeing state complaints and such at the State Department of Ed, and past work. So definitely a lot of familiarity there and resonating with me in those cases as well. So I think that you can sense and get a sense of like, okay, these are issues. You can see there's some potential material or potential failures in those cases, but it's what we want to do is, as Sarah said, equip you with kind of thinking about how to analyze the situation. How would a court or how might a state education agency look at these requirements, understanding what the requirement to implement is and what the legal standard is that gets applied. So you can use that framework in your own analysis and how to intervene locally. So let's get started on that. I mean, the overarching requirement or the kind of simple way of stating it is that IDEA requires LEAs to provide special education related services in accordance with a child's IEP. So you're required to implement this IEP. Um, it's grounded in here, the regulation for IEPs being in effect within a system. It's also grounded in the definition of free appropriate public education. So the free appropriate public education means special education related services that, and you can see the items, you're probably familiar with all of these, but you see subparagraph D, provided in conformity with an individualized education program that meets the requirements of 300, 320 to 324. So this duty to implement the IEP is supported in the regulatory language. It's also something that has been considered and applied in courts as well. So let's talk a little bit about what that duty looks like a little bit more. The legal duty to implement the IEP is one of the regulations that really kind of spells out some of the areas that you need to think about when it comes to implementing the IEP is this section 34 CFR 300.323. We're going to walk through a few examples of this fairly quickly on this slide, but you'll see, I think, some of those sights and sounds coming up sprinkled in here. And I think that's evident that this is a provision where they were thinking, okay, you got to implement the IEP. It needs to be in effect. Where are there the potential snags? Where are the glitches going to happen? And let's be clear about what's expected. So one of those glitches might be at the beginning of the school year. It isn't easy to figure out how to make sure, does everybody have that IEP in effect? Staff aware of their responsibilities? Are we ready to implement at the beginning of the year? And that's provision A. At the beginning of the school year, each public agency must have an effect for each child with a disability within its jurisdiction and IEP. So you also want to make sure you're implementing an IEP as soon, whoops, I need to back up somehow. An IEP as soon as the IEP is developed. So you go to the IEP meeting, maybe it's initial, maybe it's a review, have this IEP, the provisions are changed, IEPs are developed. There's an expectation that those are then implemented within a reasonable time. And here, as soon as possible following the development of the IEP, special and related services are made available to the child in accordance with that child's IEP. I think you also are probably familiar, you write services with anticipated start dates and things like that as well. So being very clear about the implementation side of those IEPs and following up and making sure that's all in place after those as soon as possible after the IEP is being developed. In some states, there are specific requirements in terms of the timing, especially on the initial development of an IEP. Where you may have to implement within so many days of that. And then, so there may be some specific requirements in your state around implementation of the IEP after it's been developed. Also, then accessible and informed. It doesn't fit the same kind of notion, but part of that duty to implement involves a duty to inform those that are responsible under the IEP and make IEPs accessible to those responsible for implementation of an IEP. And one of the sights and sounds we thought about putting on, we were like, there's so many you could come up with, was what I used to hear, which is, hey, we don't share the actual IEP with staff because that would be a confidentiality issue. And I would be like, oh, I appreciate the adherence and the concern over confidentiality. That is really important. But staff responsible for implementing IEP and that are a part of your LEA are allowed to see and authorized under confidentiality and FERPA requirements to have access to that IEP. And in fact, based on this provision, are required to have access to that IEP. So making sure you're accounting for that. And then the informing of them of their responsibilities. You may have a system in your jurisdiction, your LEA, or where you tend to create like snapshot IEPs, or certain people call them different things, but kind of a summary of the accommodations, modifications, and supports to be provided, and a process, hopefully, for how you're informing teachers of those responsibilities and getting that out there to all those that are responsible. The other one you'll see where some of these hot spots come from is the in-state and out-of-state transfers. Just remembering that comparable services duty. So when they transfer in, there may be some procedures for in-state where you're either adopting or developing and implementing a new IEP, or for out-of-state, you may be even evaluating to determine eligibility and then potentially adopting and implementing a new IEP. In the meantime, you provide comparable services, and it's hard to do comparable services if you don't have that IEP. You're reviewing it, figuring out what needs to be there in consultation with parents. Which brings us to our last item, transfer records. To facilitate the transition for children in these transfer situations, you must take reasonable steps to promptly obtain the child's records. And then the previous agency must take reasonable steps to promptly respond to your request. And so those procedures and the snags that can come out of those situations, I'm sure we've kind of already hinted at, some of you have experienced them, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But those are grounded in this duty to implement and in this regulatory scheme here. So when you have this legal duty to implement and maybe have a failure, what's the standard that's applied to those failures? What's the legal standard for failure to implement claims? It's a type of IDA violation that may result in a denial of FAPE. Courts and hearing officers generally apply a materiality standard. There's a couple ways to look at it. One is materiality alone, another is materiality plus this layer of educational benefit or FAPE, where it might be insufficient benefit, loss of progress. So when we talk about materiality alone, the idea is that just minor deviations are not going to rise to the level of denial for courts and hearing officers generally. So they apply this material failure to implement. It might be that it's a significant provision that was not implemented, or it might be something that was substantial failure to not implement. So it's more than a minor deviation. And then you would have a finding potentially here, or a holding of failure to implement, material failure to implement. The materiality benefit says we're going to apply that materiality standard, plus we're going to layer in, say, is there an associated loss of progress, or was there insufficient benefit related to that failure? And then just keep in mind that state agencies, through state complaints, the formal complaint process, or general supervision processes, generally do not require materiality to make a finding. So state complaints are kind of the most common area of formal dispute resolution. They come up the most often, and the standard applied there isn't necessarily applying the substantive FAPE denial of a material failure or materiality benefit failure. So just being aware of that. It does, most are going to apply some type of an more than de minimis standard. So just very trivial deviations are probably not going to potentially not going to result in a finding, but just know that this is the bar is the highest with courts and hearing officers. The bar is a little lower with state complaints and general supervision processes. And that the standard that's applied and kind of the decisions that are made there lead you into thinking about, like, what do you do about it? What's the remedy? So if you have a material failure to implement through courts and hearing officers, the remedy for that is likely going to include compensatory services or some way of compensating that child and family for the lost benefit or the missed services, the material missed services. For state complaints and general supervision, if they don't find that material denial of FAPE, they still will make findings and order corrective action. It might be training, it might be forms, might be reviewing procedures and adjusting them. So thinking about what the finding is, the remedy is kind of appropriately crafted to fit what happened in that situation. And so the remedies and state complaints and such can include a variety of things. And in courts and hearing officers, or even in state complaints, if there's a failure that's material, you will likely see things like compensatory services. Okay, so that's a legal standard. In a little bit of like legal, not total legalese, but a little bit, right? So let's talk about how would you frame that, or what would you think about that, just as an LEA leader. And so in in thinking about failure to implement situations, some ways to think about it is to ask, okay, first of all, was the IEP fully implemented? If not, what was missed? How much was missed? For how long? So when you're thinking about that materiality, if you're thinking it's a significant provision, like it was only one something that wasn't delivered, but it's a very central service to that child, that might be a factor that you need to think about. How much was missed? It was a lot of minutes that were missed, or, extensive enough to be more than a minor deviation. And then for how long? Sometimes it might not be that much, but it lasted a long time. So the duration is a factor to think about too. So analyzing what was missed and what did it really mean? How central was it to the child's services? How much quantitatively and also qualitatively was missed. You'll also then think, was there an associated loss of benefit or appropriate progress? So even if the standard is like, hey, if there's a failure, I'm still going to address it, even if it didn't result in a loss of benefit, appropriate progress, you'll want to analyze that, because if there was one, you're going to want to include that as part of what you offer. Kind of hinting at the later bullet about what you're going to do about the problem. So you need to analyze what was the impact of the missed or the implementation failure. And I added this. It's more about the what to do about it. But if you don't analyze why it was not fully implemented, it's getting at what were those risk factors, what was happening, what went wrong. And so analyzing the situation, saying not just what was missed and did it cause an impact, but why was it missed, so that you can appropriately do the next bullet, which is what did you do, or what can you do now that you've discovered the problem. So we're going to revisit that and talk a little bit about it too later in the session, about what are some of those actions you can take as a leader to address implementation failures. But when you are hit with a situation that looks like there's a failure to implement, you want to do some of these analysis, and you'll be getting at the kind of information you'd need to analyze it, similar to what a court or a state complaint investigator would do. All right. So bridging from the duty to implement, the legal standard, and kind of what kind of questions and information you would need, that all tends to focus a little bit on what it means if you have a failure. Hotspots and recognizing risk, the goal is to kind of analyze your system and think about and be aware of these hotspots so that you can avoid, as Sarah said earlier, try to avoid that potential complaint or due process case. So we've put some implementation risk hotspots here on the slide. these were reinforced with some of the sights and sounds and some of your feedback on the previous chat. But in looking at these, we've got staff shortages. That is obviously kind of a significant issue these days, as Lynn pointed out in her comment with staff shortage issues across the country. It's a very common area of concern that comes up in state complaints and failure to implement, and in cases of failure to implement. Also the slow limited records transfer processes where you just miss and didn't realize the kid had an IEP, or it takes a long time to get that information. Post IEP development communication failures. We had the meeting, we got it all settled, it got put into the system maybe even, but nobody got told what they're supposed to do, or the IEP didn't get shared. There's a step that got missed. That's a pretty common hot spot. And then we mentioned before, overly limiting access to the IEP. Don't overly limit that access to the IEP. There are times where, in order to really understand what is to be provided, a someone responsible for the provision of services needs to understand more than just that snapshot. They need to see what the levels and the goals and different aspects of the child's needs are. And the law requires that they have access. And then vague accommodations or services. So how clear is the IEP in terms of what is to be provided? And so making sure that there's clarity around what is to be provided with those, particularly with accommodations that comes up, but any of the services and supports that are in that IEP. And then another area, lack of training and IEP responsibilities. So it's hard to figure out, how do I coordinate this? Do I have a day? Do I have a common plan time? Do I take part of my back to school in service to let people know? How do I make sure that all my staff are informed of their responsibilities in the IEP, not only at the beginning of the year, but also as IEP meetings and initial development of IEPs or amendments to IEPs happen throughout the year. So that's another hot spot. We wanted to hear from you. What do you think? Just kind of not necessarily which one resonate, but what do you think in your system where you are? What are some of the hottest hot spots for you? Where do you think you are most at risk in your current system? See the poll, just pop in there what your thoughts are, and we'll look at and see what people are thinking. A little bit of time for everyone to respond. Okay, I'm not sure. Let's see what we've got here. Okay, interesting. I feel like the overly limiting, I'm realizing that whole like we don't share them because it's confidential might have just been me and my experiences in some cases. But staff shortages at the top, not surprising there. They are also some of the hardest ones to figure out how to mitigate or how to address and avoid. Obviously, there's only so much you can control in your LEA. Slow records, but that post IEP development communication failures, that's another pretty high up there on the list. That's interesting too. I think that's going to, like, you go to that trouble, you have that meeting. Whoever's in the meeting is probably aware, but we know we don't have every teacher or staff member or secretary, anybody responsible for implementing there. And vague accommodations, lack of training a bit as well. So thank you for those responses. It's interesting. So we'll keep that in mind, because later in the session, before we go, we're going to talk to you a little bit about like what's something maybe you want to address or you might want to do differently in your system. So thinking about what your most risky areas are might help inform that. All right. I am going to move us to leadership lens. So these are some failure to implement case examples. We're going to use case examples from, past years to just kind of think about spotting issues, look at how states have analyzed failure to implement cases, really just to highlight some of these scenarios that tend to come up across the country in state complaints and cases addressing failure to implement. All right, so I'm going to review a case. some of you may not notice it, but you'll see a little bit of a pattern in our slide titles. I am giving a bit of a nod to Encyclopedia Brown, but don't get overly hung up on it. It's just trying to kind of make it, but this is the case for clarity. Um, the facts are that a high school student with an undisclosed disability has an IEP. IEP team added an accommodation for assistive technology for written work. It said tape recording could be used. Portable word processing with predictive language software can be available. The students refusing the word processor device that was provided or offered and eventually returns it to the school, and the parent files a complaint. So I think you can already kind of see there's a case for clarity here with the facts, but I did add a couple other things just so you know. A lot of times, uh, when you end up in a state complaint, when some issue or challenge, disagreement between the LEA and a parent, or another person, anyone can file a state complaint. When it gets to the case of filing, it's usually something has happened to kind of like, the straw that broke the camel's back, but it doesn't mean that that's the only issue. So most cases, most state complaints have multiple issues presented. And so in this particular situation, there were also issues where the school unilaterally changed placement of the student due to course offering changes. So, and because of the way courses were offered, instead of in a functional academic separate setting, the students receiving a bunch of their minutes in a gen ed setting. And also the school didn't have like a case manager for the child for 13 days, and it was a state law requirement. So there were some other facts that affected the overall determinations of the complaint investigator. But in this case, material failure to implement the IEP, that is partly due to this unilateral change in placement. There were literally like thousands of minutes missed because of the placement not being the appropriate placement in the child's IEP. But it did also include remedies and finding a substantiated complaint around the tape recording and the portable word processing. So write those accommodations clearly. Make sure that they're ready to be implemented and that staff are implementing them. And if you have a challenge where, somebody's refusing it or you're not sure what to do or when to provide the word processing, how to really implement it within your curriculum, you should talk to the special ed case manager or special ed staff in that case. So the remedy involved training on development and implementation of IEPs plus some compensatory services. All right, I'm going to open up to just a little discussion here with Sarah.
Yeah, I just was thinking, I cannot stop thinking about how might the result have been different if the staff had been explained how to implement the modification to the classroom teachers, and
Right.
if the assistive technology device had actually been provided, used, even though it was pretty vague. I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on this? Maybe in the chat. How could this have been different? Also, I'm just realizing these are all, while people are putting their answers in, I'm just realizing how many of these situations come up quite a bit that put you in this weird legal risk spot.
Yeah.
Because this is so real. Being a middle school special ed, a former special educator, students would refuse those accommodations.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and there may be multiple ways. I love your question because it kind of gets at the idea of like, what are you going to do about this? Or how could this have been
Yeah.
potentially avoided? Like, are there, and another word we'll talk about later is just mitigating. So mitigating the issue. And one way to mitigate this, maybe the IP is still vague. But if you've explained the responsibilities and there's an understanding of what to provide, this issue may not have come up, at least this particular section of this issue. I think that it's a good question to ask and see. I think maybe we did just have a chat. I don't know if somebody popped into the chat about how it would be different, but I can tell you that in whether it's a state complaint investigator, but particularly, courts, hearing officers, they will consider things in terms of like, how did you mitigate that? When they're trying to think, is it a material failure? They're going to look at some of these circumstances, right? So to the extent you could mitigate, lack of clarity in the IEP by providing the training or things like that, there is a potential to be able to kind of ease the legal ramifications of this type of a failure. So you can definitely mitigate by trying to make sure that people understand their responsibilities to implement.
Yeah, and Sarah put in the chat she's uncomfortable with a tape recording could be used. Portable word processing with predictive language software can be available. I think that comes back to that training on development of IEPs, right, Sarah? Absolutely.
Yeah, it's and I think that we have resources. We'll get to some of those later, but definitely going back to that idea of like, how do you review and provide training and guidance to your staff around clearly worded IEPs, but particularly accommodations tends to be a challenge, right? So, the frequency, location, duration. In this case, the way they talked about it is like it wasn't clear when. The when was not real clear. So that can be, sounds a little like an as needed type of language. So definitely a red flag in your language. And how do you review those? Do you have a system for kind of checking them? Do you provide guidance to staff on making sure that those accommodations are clear? All right, we have another case. I don't know if that, let me know if that's on this particular one, Sarah, but
No,
our
I'm
next
just
one is
saying, I've commented and said, say it louder for the people in the back. Those accommodations can be really risky spots, right?
that's right. Um, Yeah, so the accommodations that the other one you had already highlighted in the poll and in our sights and sounds, but the failure to implement this case is the case of the missing teacher. So if you can imagine some of the facts here involve some staff vacancies, some inability of the LEA to fill staff vacancies. There's an eighth grade student with a disorder. IEP required 60 minutes of special ed services in gen ed, 5 days a week, and 15 minutes outside every other week. The 30 minutes a day in science was provided, but the 30 minutes a day for English was inconsistent until late September. This is kind of at the beginning of the year. And 60 minutes of service outside of gen ed, 60 minutes of those 15 minutes every other week were missed because of these staff vacancies. The kicker, too, is that this staff vacancy didn't just affect this parent's child. This parent learned of the staffing shortages actually through discussions with teachers and filed a formal state complaint for missed services for their child and on behalf of other students that were not receiving their services. So state complaints can involve both individual and systemic complaints, and investigators will assess that. And then remedies and the findings and everything relate not only to whoever this particular child is, the parent might be, child of the parent, but other students as well. And also, just for me, it's a note that remember that anyone can file a complaint. You don't have to be the parent of the child or things like that to file a state complaint. So, with these facts in mind, it's not a significant amount of services to some degree, right? This 30 minutes a day, it was inconsistent till September. There were 60 total minutes outside of gen ed were missed due to staff vacancies. But in the end, the amount of time, the amount of miss, at least particularly in this case for a state complaint, there was a determination there was a failure to implement the services in accordance with the IEP, and there was a requirement to develop a compensatory services plan for that child and for all the other eighth grade children that were impacted by the shortage. And so there's definitely some time coordinating with state agency and complaint investigator around this corrective action and trying to figure out what to do. Um, one of the corrective actions can also tend to be something related to at least verifying that you're making good faith efforts to hire in these hard to fill positions, or what are your steps are you taking to get staff. And I think it's not just hiring, but you also probably need to say, what do I do to evaluate my existing staff, their schedules? How am I going to be able to figure out potentially a way to mitigate the issue here and provide some of the services? Also, potentially substitutes, things like that. So, there's some compensatory services planned for the child, other children, as well as some documentation regarding what they're doing to make sure this staffing vacancy gets filled.
So, Alina, a question that I have for the group then is how would you know services were not being delivered until September? Like, what are the things that you would do to know that services were not being delivered? So, any thoughts from our experts here?
Yeah, oftentimes, Sarah, like the complaint, how they found out and how the parent found out in the complaint is how the LEA found out is from the parent filing the complaint is usually where you don't want to be, right?
Yeah, so don't say that, right?
Does anyone have a system or a way they find out? Or how has it happened for you that you
Yeah.
figured out?
Sarah put in the chat regularly reviews service log documentation. Yeah, that's a great
Hmm.
system to have in place. Anybody else do
Yep.
other things? Yeah, Catherine says that they have developed service logs and they ask that schools immediately send a notice to parents and then communicate quarterly with parents on missed services. I think that's so great, right? That kind of
Yes.
Alina was talking about that. That communication piece is so important with our parents and caregivers.
Yeah. Those are great. It is hard. I mean, sometimes you'll find out like making sure that it's kind of that open door too of like what's the communication protocol? Do staff know who to go to if there's a gap? Do your building principals know who to go to? Do you even know? First of all, in this case, they did most likely know they had a staff vacancy they were unable to fill and there's a shortage. Um, but how is it being communicated? How is it being addressed so that you internally, whether you're a leader at the district level, the building level, whatever point in time, place in the system you are, making sure that people feel comfortable being able to alert, or you have a system for checking and finding out. And so you don't have to find out because you just got notice of a state complaint filed. All right, our last case, failure to implement case, the case of the BIP breakdown. So in this situation, it's a 6-year-old kindergarten student with communication disorder. The district completed an FBA and a BIP for the student. Um, the FBA and the BIP could not be accessed electronically by the regular ed teacher, and even though the IEP could be accessed electronically. So this is a very technical, but like they could get to the IEP, but they couldn't get to the BIP. And then the IEP does include some elements of the BIP, but it didn't fully incorporate it. The student substitute teacher also just there was a lot of interviewing and log checking and different things in some of these cases by the way, but the substitute teacher was entirely unaware of the student's IEP and the BIP was also kind of determined. So there's a lack of access to that IEP BIP provision. Once you've decided that BIP is needed, making sure that it's in that IEP. The finding failure to implement resulting from the failure to provide the teacher and substitute teacher access to the IEP. They also actually had a failure. It was a failure to incorporate the BIP, or the BIP needed to be in the IEP. If it's determined that it's needed, it needed to be in that IEP, not like in a separate place or inaccessible. So a little bit of that wrapped in to this finding. And then the remedy is guidance and training the staff in the development implementation of an IEP. So there may be times where the implementation failure is still, this is an example, like maybe it wasn't a huge failure to implement situation, but it still warranted a finding, and there's guidance and training and development and implementation IEP for the staff, because we need to address it. So state complaints are going to provide for some of these remedies. They don't have to rely. It doesn't have to rise to the level of a denial of fate.
Yeah, so since we have some really great suggestions in the chat already, I want to know what systems do you guys have in place to ensure that substitutes and support staff know what's included on a student's IEP? This was one that we really struggled with. And Alina, while they're writing their answers in the chat, we had a question come up around what would the compensatory ed piece look like from the previous example? Do you remember from that particular case or have examples?
Okay, yeah. I'm just going to go back to it if I can real quick so I can remember what we just talked about. I can't find my arrows, Sarah. Oh, there we go. Okay.
It was the compensatory
Um,
ed piece for the student who is missing service minutes.
Oh, yes. Okay. For the 60 minutes
Mm-hmm.
and the 15 minutes. Yeah. The
Mm-hmm.
compensatory ed, I think, so what it, I don't remember exactly how it panned out because I think sometimes what they'll do is say, you all need to meet as an IP team, make a plan, and a parent may have to sign off on that plan. Things like that can happen. Um, it doesn't necessarily have to be minute for minute generally. So a compensatory services plan for this will sometimes designate a minimum number of minutes, specify a certain number of minutes. It's like, what would it take to make up for the missed benefit? Or if this was a failure to implement services, how could you implement kind of a meaningful amount of those services in order to put the student in a position they would have been had it been implemented? So it's typically not necessarily minute for minute. It's either get together as an IP team, work with a parent, come up with a plan that makes sense for putting the student in the position they would have been had you not failed to implement, or it may designate a certain amount of minutes and delivery, kind of based on what the kind of meaningful missed services amount is. On the one that had thousands of minutes missed, it was a lot, but they did not do it. Was like the student was supposed to have 1,800 minutes of like a BIP implementation a day, or I mean, a week, not a day, a week. And they couldn't really verify very much of that, but there was definitely a recognition of like, there's only so many minutes, like kind of effective ability to implement those services. And so it was like an hour a day is how they ended up with the compensatory services in that model. But it can vary a lot. So I think that's really about thinking about what would it take to put the student back in a position had you, implemented the IEP appropriately, and or make a plan with a parent, submit the plan to the state, and then they'll let you know if they think it's sufficient or not.
That's great. Thank you so much. And so, on this case of the
Mhm.
BIP breakdown, Alicia is just killing it with her system. She has teachers or the behavior therapist review with the substitute and a brief meeting and a check in to ensure plans are being followed and times are being met for students on an IEP. Wow, that's awesome. I think that's also
Yes.
that distributed leadership piece too. So you don't have to have that, feel that anxiety that when you leave, that there are people that are covering for you. So that's wonderful. Thank you, Alicia.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I think I have a sister that subbed quite a bit, and so I would get a lot of feedback in the systems where I was. I could get some inside track, but I know that subs want to do a good job and getting. So it'll also help you in finding and keeping your substitute teachers to provide that kind of training and support for them and the implementation of the IEP, and all those accommodations and supports that kids might need while they're there. So I love that. Okay, so that was our um, last case example, but we want to talk, and we've already been getting at this, and you guys have been, as I just doing a fantastic job of identifying some of those practices, some system elements that you can put in place to make sure that you can hopefully avoid and or quickly address and mitigate any kind of failure to implement. So we're going to talk through a little bit about what you can do. And just quickly, it's definitely reiterating some of the examples you all have already shared. But when you're thinking about preventing the failure to implement, that's that being proactive and saying, what are those hot spots that I know could come up? I got to be clear. I'm going to check my IPs. Are we clearly stating what's to be provided? Am I providing training and support for IEP implementation to the staff that are responsible, to substitutes? So you guys have already touched on that, but be clear, support. Then document. Sometimes there's various approaches to it. Um, and in some cases, they might say, hey, there's no requirement to write down every single thing you do and prove it in that way. But some level of documentation sure does make it easier and is definitely going to be expected when you get a failure to implement case. The other reason about documenting implementation IP is it's hard for you to system check it. So you guys already mentioned, like, I might have a services log, or we have an accommodations checklist, or we do something so that we can document, and then I can spot check and make sure that these IPs are being implemented before it becomes a problem. And then communicate. So communicating with staff about the IEP, making sure that they understand their responsibilities, they have access to it, all of those pieces. Also, a way to prevent is doing that analysis. So don't wait for someone to say there's a problem. You're going to conduct service and schedule reviews, particularly with the staff shortages. I think that because staff shortages and coverage is such an issue, really, how do you review services and supports and the schedules on a regular basis to identify some hotspots so you can adjust them, but also it gives you're prepared to address an issue should it come up. Someone suddenly needs to be gone. There's some type of maybe a workplace injury or something happens, and now you're struggling to be able to provide a special education teacher in a situation. You want to be ready with the data and information so that you can maybe shift providers or adjust how services delivered. Maybe even work with a building principal about delivery and scheduling of how this is going to work. So conducting service analysis, I used to do it. We had a chart that was like 15-minute increments. Where are the kids that need services? Who's providing it? What does it look like? And what you'll find, I think, a lot of times is there's going to be a big, bulky amount of services to be provided between like 10 and noon every day. And then I have a lot less services in the afternoon. So you're going to find opportunities to maybe intervene and adjust based on schedule and service delivery to help you through some of these shortage situations. Also, then guiding, having clear procedures, forms, checklists, not just the long written procedures, but thinking about checklists and tools to help staff implement and follow procedures in those IPs. And then, sorry, I realize now I'm going to move quicker. Mitigating. So once you identify if there is an issue, investigate, gather all that documentation information, communicate. Someone already mentioned it. I would definitely reiterate, communicate with parents. You do not want them to find out from someone else. Or to have their kid come home and say, no one's been doing this for months, or, whatever. Make sure that you're the one communicating about challenges, implementing the IEP, and then mitigate the impact through schedule analysis, shifting supports, offering additional or different supports, and working with the parent to try to mitigate the implementation failure. And then if there's an issue where there's a material failure or something, more than a minor deviation, you're going to want to proactively make up for those failures to implement with compensatory services. Make an offer. In one case, I can't remember if it's one of the ones we highlighted, but there are times where the LEA said, hey, here's what we offered. We already offered to the parent to do this many minutes in this format before next fall. Like maybe over the summer, she just has to reach out. The investigator said, hey, I agree with that. So that's what I'm ordering. So there are times where being proactive can help you in avoiding some of the failure complaints. All right, that was quick, but you all had such great examples and answers earlier that you kind of made that part easy. So let's close out. Whoops, clicking too fast now. The bottom line, failure to implement can result in a denial of FAPE. Most implementation failures are preventable through strong systems, communication, training, and that proactive monitoring. And then when implementation challenges occur, early communication and offering some ways to offering corrective action to reduce the harm to students is really important. All right. Before you go.
Before you
Go
leave
ahead,
off this
Sarah. Yeah.
slide, Alina,
Mhm.
too, I love the fact that, it's also about building trust on that last point. And I think that is something that when we see state complaints or we see due process, it is a failure of the family trusting the LEA any longer. So I
Right.
think that's really important to underscore too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's great because it's important to keep in mind when you get into the materiality and was it minor or deviations, whatever, for the most part, any failure to implement the IP, however small, is going to potentially create a trust breakdown between the school and the family, and it impacts the kid and the staff. And so really making sure you're thinking about it from that perspective, I think is really important. All right. So we just had quick thinking before we launch you off after this webinar, thinking about it based on your hotspots, what you said, hey, I've experienced this is resonating with me, or here's where I think we're most at risk in our system. And some of these, what you can do to mitigate, what you can do to prevent these issues. This is a fill in the blank. the best, one of the easier kinds of quizzes, right? This isn't really a quiz. This is more an action, call to action. But in the next 30 days, we will blank so that IEP implementation becomes more reliable. So if you take a minute, I know we're a little bit over, share one next step in the chat with us, or kind of offer your thoughts. Just jot it down for yourself if you don't put it in the chat, so that there's something kind of an action that you're taking away from our discussion today. What's some area you want to shore up and what you might do about it in your system in the next 30 days? Little wait time, but putting this out in a little bit over time too. So
Great, Sarah. That's an awesome one. Communicate those IEP implementation expectations, right? School, I don't know about you guys. School hasn't quite started for us yet, but I know school's back in session and all of the things. Everyone needs to know all of the things. So it's a great time to communicate those IEP implementation expectations. Alicia, communicate expectations for implementing accommodations. Yeah, right. This again, the accommodations ones, it seems like you should throw everything in the kitchen sink at an accommodation, but if the student doesn't need it, that can open you to the risk. Catherine, guide schools to establish and use communication protocols and implement service logs. Yes, those service logs, 9 times out of 10, are going to make or break a state complaint. Just truly having those service logs for IEP implementation is so, so helpful. Yeah, Catherine got a 100% by Sarah on that one. I so agree.
I love it. Yeah. And
And you,
there are lots of potential areas you might intervene, and it can be small steps. It's like shoring up some small things can make a big difference in being able to avoid some of these implementation issues.
great. Well, thank you guys
Excellent.
so much. I feel like this has been, I've learned something and it made me feel not so alone. So that's great. I don't want to say we've saved the best for last, but boy, our next session is going to be a heavy hitter one. And I think right at the time when kids are coming back to school, school's been in session for a month. We're now starting, the newness is wearing off. Everyone's letting their guard down a bit. So I think it's very timely. But on September 22nd, we're going to have our next session when behavior meets discipline. So, navigating those behavior supports and manifestation determinations for students with disabilities. So, we're going to look at manifestation determinations. We're going to look at those removals and the adequacy of that behavior supports and how those intersect, and where you, as district folks, can face exposure when teams focus too narrowly on discipline alone. So I'm going to put the link in the chat. Please register for that one. I have a feeling it's going to be a widely attended one. We also, I've been putting some links in the chat too for the Progress Center. So if we go to the next slide, we have so many resources. I would be spamming the chat if I put every single resource in, but especially around IEP implementation. Check out our resources. They are so good. They're free for you. And there's people behind each one of them that can help you if you need any support. If you don't currently know about our services, a great way to get connected with the Progress Center, if you go to the next slide, is the our newsletter. So it's not we don't send it out all the time, but if you want to stay connected with us, subscribe to our newsletter, where we have just a wealth of information and we push those resources like Catherine does. I'm so glad you love the resources and that they are super amazing. Kat already put this in the chat, but we also have an evaluation for us. Thank you so much. This is not an easy time of the year to attend something like this, so that is not missed on us, and we really appreciate you all participating. And for sure, we will see you on the next one. So we'll give you about a couple minutes to fill out the survey, and then we look forward to seeing you on September 22nd. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell anyone. It's going to be a great session.